Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here. Let me say, I did not have the good fortune to be a direct student of Linus Welch's, but I've been an indirect student. Benefited a lot from his work on linear synthesis of a skill, from education production, and that I feel like the work leading into estimation of labor demand models and using labor tools to understand aggregates and the macroeconomy has been formative for me. So I feel like a student once removed. So this is on a different subject. This is on the U.S. Social Security Disability Insurance's joint work with Nicole Maestas and Kathleen Mullen and Alexi Strand. Nicole and Kathleen being Jim Smith's colleagues at RAND. And, oh great. So just by way of background, as many of you know, the disability system in the U.S. has been growing very rapidly since the early 1990s. And at this point encompasses about 4.7% of non-elderly adults, 25 to 64, are full-time recipients of Social Security Disability Insurance, meaning that they can participate only to a limited extent in the labor force, and they receive substantial transfer income from the federal government. So at present, there are 8.8 million disabled beneficiaries and 2.1 million dependents. Cash benefits are about $135 billion a year. And then the Medicare, people receive Medicare 2 years after joining SSDI, or actually 2 years after the onset of disability. And so those benefits come to another $66 billion that are not counted as part of the SSDI budget. And this has become a more salient issue recently because the SSDI trust fund will be exhausted within a couple of years, although I'm sure there will be some kind of nominal fix to that. To qualify for SSDI, a worker needs to be insured based on their recent work history. Generally, they have to have worked 20 quarters in the last 10 years. They need to have a physical or mental disability that must preclude substantial gainful activity. Usually, at present, that means earnings in excess of $1,000 a month, and it's supposed to be medically determinable, and it lasts for at least 1 year. And there are two weighting components to applying for disability. One is that there must be at least 5 months from disability onset until receipt. And in that time, very few people would consider, even if they were planning to work afterwards, very few of them would consider working in that waiting period because you want to establish the fact that you are disabled. Medicare entitlement then starts 2 years after the start of cash benefits. So there's been a long-standing economics literature studying how the disability program interacts with the labor market. Don Parsons in 1980 launches this literature, and he concludes that SSDI program doubled the non-employment rate among males 45 to 54 between 1948 and 1976. And his basic approach was to regress individuals' labor force participation on their projected replacement rate. In other words, the ratio of what they would earn on SSDI or what would they receive on SSDI relative to what their current earnings were. That approach was criticized by John Bound, who said, well, you know, as people get sicker, their earnings fall, so obviously their replacement rate would go up, but we shouldn't view that as an incentive effect. That's more mechanical than that. So his suggestion instead was to compare people who were denied disability with those who were allowed disability and say, well, since the people who are denied are healthier than the people who were allowed, then their labor force participation kind of places an upper bound on how much people who are denied could actually be working. And he concludes that disability might reduce labor force participation by about 30 percentage points among those at the margin of being awarded. Don Parsons rejoined that line of argument by saying, well, people who are denied may just be different, right? They may actually be people who don't want to work but aren't that healthy. But aren't that sick, excuse me. And a second point, which is where the focus of our paper is, that the disability application process itself may erode labor force capacity. So in particular, if you look at delays in the application process, so people who were initially allowed onto the program only spend 3.7 months on average. However, that's 33% of applicants. Another 34% are allowed on appeal or reapplication. And so the average waiting time of people who are actually allowed onto the program is more than 1.25 years. If you look at people who are denied, they also spend on average 1 year applying for the program. And so there's a substantial amount of waiting that goes on. So 53% of applicants face at least a year applying for this program. And it's actually hard to know when the application process ends. Because the way it works in practice is you go to an SSA field office, a disability determination office, you apply, your app is randomly assigned to an examiner within that office. I should say random assignment, there's a little bit of slippage there. In certain types of cases, they have specialists. And then if you're allowed, usually a decision is made within a few months, you commence benefits. If you're denied, you can either stop or you can appeal for redetermination. There's then a second administrative determination, takes a number of months. In general, 90% of cases, that administrative determination reinforces the initial decision. But then you can apply again to administrative law judge. A lot of people do that. Conditional on applying, about 75% of cases that go up to the ALJ level are then allowed. So the administrative law judges reverse about 75% of the cases that they see. If you're denied there, you can go to the federal appeals court. So there's an extremely long right-hand tail of outcomes. So even in our data, we're going to look at a period from 2005 to 2011. There are still people we can't tell if they're done applying. Yes?
It might be helpful in virtual versions of this slide just to have the fractions.
Yeah,
end up on each file.
definitely. And it's,
really make it easier.
yeah, it should. And it should also have the months associated. Yeah, I was having the very same thought. Okay, so we're really focused on this decay channel that Parsons pointed out in 1980. Does the waiting time affect people's labor force participation? In other words, when they are ultimately rejected from the program, do they work as much as they would have worked at the time they applied? And even for people who were allowed onto the program, who can work to some degree, is their work capacity also affected by the long period of time they spend out of the labor force? So why is this important potentially? Well, one is that everybody has to wait. And it could affect both allowed and denied applicants. So it could be an effect on a substantial number of people. You know, at present, over 2 million adults per year are applying for this SSDI program. So it's really a lot of, you know, if each of them spends 1 year out of the labor force, right, that's a couple million person years. Yes?
So is there also a legal cost in this process?
Yes, well, so it's all done on contingency, actually. So when you go up to the ALJ level, there's a standard contract that the SSA requires attorneys to use where if they represent you and they win, they get 25% of your back payment up to $6,000 something. So, and then the SSA pays them that. So currently the SSA makes $1.4 billion a year in direct payments to lawyers that prevail against it in front of ALJs. Okay. So a second reason, and let me say, I mean, horrible as that sounds, they're structuring the contract so it isn't more exploitative, right? They don't want lawyers getting 60% commission. So second question, of course.
Good lawyers coming up against the judge.
Well, so okay, so there's law. It's actually one of the few growth areas in law. So Binder and Binder is the poster child. They prevail against SSA in more than 5,000 cases a year. And they've been extremely successful doing so, and they're actually now investment firms that are investing in the law firms that represent disability cases. So it's just kind of a what percentage of those prevail? On average, so people who are represented by attorneys are more likely to prevail than those who do not. So given that the overall success rate is about 75%, they would be 80% or above. So one reason this might be important is there's a lot of people. A second, of course, is this sort of this broader question of duration dependency in non-participation. Most recent paper by Croft, Longa, and Noda Digdo, but there's a long literature on this, and we think this variation is related to that. And then it turns out also importantly that ignoring this decay channel actually biases existing estimates of the consequences of being allowed or denied. The reason is the most recent work actually by my co-authors, Mastis, Mullen, and Strand, totally upfront about this, uses examiner leniency as an instrumental variable for allowances. Well, if you go to a more lenient examiner, you're allowed quickly and you receive benefits. If you go to a less lenient examiner, you're denied, but then you're more likely to appeal. And so their approach effectively compares people who are allowed quickly to people who are denied slowly. Well, if there's a decay effect, right, the people who are denied slowly are losing labor force capacity as time goes on, so the contrast between them understates the amount of labor force capacity lost simply because of the allowance. Okay, so what I'm going to do, first I'm going to give you a very brief conceptual framework, show you our estimation strategy, then I will show you estimates for the people who are initially allowed, people who get a positive decision. Then, that's right. That's right. So we're taking our labor force participation numbers as actual, right? And they may, in fact, understate the degree of. I'm sure they do understate the degree of economic activity by people who are disability.
I've arranged my life in such a way that there's an investment time.
Right.
So
Oh, I see.
found ways that I can just get
I see.
So now I'm better at doing that.
I see. Okay. So you're saying that your value of leisure has increased. That's possible. Yeah. So in which case that we shouldn't view these as direct costs, right?
But it doesn't really matter. It's just like relative.
Right. But yeah. Okay. But if you were trying to convert these effects into sort of economic losses, right? If the value of leisure is growing endogenously, then we shouldn't count them as all as losses. Not that we're doing that in this paper anyway. There's no accounting, but.
I mean, there's been some investment that
Right.
That's
right.
Right.
Then I'll show you estimates for allowed and denied applicants. I'll show you these. There's a reason these are separate sections. I'll talk about waiting time bias that show you how this decay channel actually affects prior estimates, and turns out the allowance effect, the direct effect of getting an award, is about 50% bigger once you account for this than generally allowed estimated. So the simple idea of our model is that time out of the labor force erodes latent work capacity. If there's any fixed cost of participation, then if you stay out of the labor force for some reason, i.e. to apply for benefits, the likelihood that your capacity will then exceed the fixed cost of work declines over time, right? So in particular, we say latent capacity alpha IT is just equal to alpha IT minus 1 plus a IID error term. But if you're out of the labor force, it also decays at this rate lambda. So lambda is our decay effect. And then we assume that there's some fixed cost of working pi, so you only work if alpha IT is greater than pi. So every time alpha falls below pi, you will not enter labor force unless it bounces up again, which it can do, right, because it's a random walk. Yes? Yes, so you're absolutely right. The model is incomplete, right? Because there's some option value to continue to work when it's above pi. That would give you a different pi. It would still be time invariant, right? But you would actually be willing to work when when your earnings were below the fixed cost of working, just to maintain the option value. So that's correct, and that's not in the model. It's in a footnote. Okay. So the evolution of earnings, if you're not applying, it's simply this. Your YIT, your observed Y, is a function of what alpha is relative to pi. If you are applying, or if you're interacting with the disability system, if you are waiting for an examiner or waiting in the 5-month decision period, you will not work, right? You can actually work in theory, but if you go to any of the disability websites, the disabilitysecrets.com, they say, don't make the mistake of working while you're applying for disability. You're supposed to be disabled, right? Okay, so we're going to assume people do not work in this period. If they receive disability, they may work if it's worth to them to work not greater than the substantial gainful activity level, right? So that may make work unattractive, in that the fixed cost might be pretty high. Obviously, if they are neither awarded benefits nor are they on the program or waiting a decision, then their labor supply would be as before. So very simple implications of this. One is that applying for SSDI will tend to reduce subsequent labor force participation regardless of whether or not you're awarded benefits. So this is a non-incentive effect, right? The incentive comes early. The labor force participation effect in the long run is a non-incentive effect. Second of all, if you're awarded benefits within the 5-month waiting period, variation in processing time will have no marginal effect on your subsequent labor supply, because you're going to stay out 5 months in any case. On the other hand, if you're awarded after a 5-month waiting period, marginal variation in processing time will affect your subsequent labor force participation, because that, at the margin, keeps you out of the labor force for more months. Okay, so here's our very simple causal model of labor supply. So we have a labor supply person of person I assigned to examiner J. We're treating this as random assignment. This is really an administrative rotation. Delta is the coefficient on time out of the labor force, the waiting time, in other words, the decay rate. Gamma is the coefficient on the direct effect of being awarded. And so the total effect of SSDI application for those who are allowed is gamma plus delta T, i.e. the decay effect plus the direct level effect. For those who are denied, it's delta T, right? Just the waiting time times the decay effect. Again, assuming a constant decay effect. The literature has focused exclusively on estimating gamma, right? Our focus primarily is on estimating this delta term, although it's going to turn out it has implications for estimates of gamma. So, pictorially, you can think of us as just doing this, right? This thing is the award effect. This thing is the decay effect. But what's important to realize is when people compare people who are allowed to those who are not allowed, they're going to be at different points along these loci, right? Depending on how long they've been waiting. And so you can't actually get a consistent estimate of that height without making sure you're controlling, you're making T equivalent among both groups. Okay. So the problem, of course, is that the time someone spends waiting for an award is also a function of their health, right? People who are very sick are going to get compassionate allowances. People who have more marginal conditions are much more likely to have to appeal. And so you can't simply use the observed waiting time. So instead, we're going to use examiner speed as an instrument for waiting time. So we're using administrative data from SSA. Within DDS offices, examiners are randomly assigned, unless you have very specialized impairments. And we're just going to use the leave-out mean, what's the jackknife instrumental variable. So it's the residual time the examiner spent with all the other cases other than you, as a prediction of how long the examiner spends deciding for you. Yeah. He used the administrative law judge ID. Some are hard, some are easy. We're going to use that too. That's right. So we're going to use two dimensions of examiner. So what the French and Song did is they used the administrative law judges. And that's more complicated because it's later in the process, right? That's well into when that's intrinsically correlated with your health at the time by the time you reach the ALJ, right? But it's closely related idea, and their paper is published.
I was just worried that fast and slow correlated with lenient or tough.
Actually, it's a good point. It is not. However, I'll show you this in a minute. But it's not, but you're absolutely going in the right direction. All right. So let me just say, we're assuming conditional random assignment of examiners and that cases processed by fast examiners would take longer if processed by slow examiners and vice versa. So homogeneity assumption. The data, I'll just say, are a kind of alphabet soup of different SSA administrative sources. Okay, and there's a lot of data. But it basically comes down to we have sampled about 1.4 million applications, 1.1 million after we're done. Okay, so let me just show you that this is the adjusted distribution of residual examiner times, and basically, 90% of the variation is between plus and minus 2 months, right? So these are not huge variation that I will say we were surprised that we were able to get something out of this. So just to show you the first stage of this is the coefficient on examiner time for the waiting time to final decision, right? So here's what no control. It's the initially allowed. They don't appeal. So final decision is the initial allowance, right? And it has a coefficient of about 1. For the initially denied, it's greater than 1. And that's because, as it'll turn out, people who spend longer waiting initially are more likely to appeal. Which is consistent, by the way, with their human capital deteriorating. So here we add assignment variables, non-assignment variables, body system codes, and basically you get, this is not surprising, but it is the case that the examiner to whom you are assigned has some effect on the amount of time you spend waiting for initial decision. Now, it also turns out this guy. Right. This one falls too.
I know, but
yeah, it's not nearly as big.
Not nearly.
That's right. That's correct. It's not nearly as large. So it's still, on the order of 12%. but it's not as large an effect. And right. So, right. Yeah, no, I think that that's a good point. And yep. Yep. No.
So there's an alternative explanation that guy was denied because they wanted to find a job. And the guy said, what have you been doing for the last 3 months? Well, I've been trying to do SFI, and I didn't get it. So he said, well, I don't think I want to hire you.
Sure. It can be any. It doesn't have to be skills depreciation. It could be changed in the labor market's willingness to hire you. Right. We're going to see it 6 years out, by the way. So it's not a sort of temporary effect of simply being out of labor force another month in terms of your experience earnings profile. I think it's somewhat mysterious why it is as persistent as it is. Well, let me wait till I get to results and then we can interpret. Well, I mean, it's consistent with the evidence from the recent paper by Noto and others that does a kind of a audit study where you put holes in people's resume and you find employers are less likely to call them back, right? So that's on the those are non-existent people, so there isn't any actual decay. But in terms of employers' willingness to hire them, there's a decline. That could be, employers may be adjusting for the expected decay.
You would think they would.
That's right. Okay, good. So. But now let me show you. So it turns out there's no relationship between examiner speed and the initial allowance probability. This is insignificant, right? So it's not the case that faster examiners are more lenient or slower. However, people who have a longer examiner are more likely to continue their claim. In particular, they're more likely to appeal, and ultimately they're more likely to be allowed, right? So although examiner time has no effect on initial allowance, it does affect ultimate allowance, which means that if you're going to look at the effect of allowance, along with the effect of waiting time, you need a second instrument for allowances, because otherwise both variables are affected by.
Can you give us 0.00274 in a sentence?
Derek, I've always wanted to say this. The coefficient is 0.00274. No, what that means is a 1 month increase in waiting. 1 month longer waiting time increases the probability that you will continue your claim by 2/5 of a percentage points.
Isn't another interpretation that slow guys just do a worse job, so they end up giving it to guys who shouldn't get it. Therefore,
I see.
there are more guys left who should get it in the pool of guys who pass on, so you end up with a higher total acceptance.
I guess I'm not sure how to test that, right? I mean, it's an interesting question, and because I can say, well, I should look at their allowance rate.
How well they predict, if you look at characteristics of that,
Yeah.
worse at getting the right guy.
Right.
I mean, I'm just saying that would be an
Yeah.
alternative
Yep.
interpretation.
Absolutely.
Let guys who should
Yep.
they let the right number through.
Right.
They kind of know I'm supposed to let this many guys through.
Right.
They're really lazy.
Well, let me say it's not correlated with.
About a standard deviation, right?
What?
1 month is about a standard deviation.
Correct. That's right.
So this is
Small.
very precisely estimated zero, almost. I mean,
No, it's a precisely estimated 0.002.
I'm just saying that if the base is 0.64, this is not a lot.
That's okay. I mean, we're living in instrumental variables world, right? I mean, we're dividing everything through by our first stage.
I think an interesting way to express this is what is its effect on the present value of the subsidy that will be given for the rest of their life.
Right. Okay. Good.
And that's
Okay. There you go. Well, so the present value of a disability award is on the order of $300,000, right? So this is 1/500th of that, so $6,000. Yep. Right. But I'm saying a 1 month increase in delay, right, has a present value of benefits of $600, right? That's not accounting for the labor force reduction for that individual. So, yeah.
month effect independent of the exam.
Sure.
I applied on
Oh.
January 1st.
Yeah. Well, we have not. I mean, we're controlling for those, but we're not. We haven't studied what those month effects are. So let me. So the second strategy. So to instrument for the actual allowance, we're going to use examiner leniency. This is just a second aspect of examiners. But let me show you. This is examiner processing time, the residual. This is examiner allowance rates, the residual, right? There's no relationship between these two. So it's not the case. Now, it could still be the case that slower examiners are making worse decisions, but they're not making systematically more or less generous decisions, right? But I have to think about how to unpack that, right? It's a very interesting question. So we're going to use these two characteristics of examiner assignments as independent sources of variation for the outcomes of people who apply. And let me just show you how that works. Here's examiner time and the probability of SSDI receipt. And so we know that slower examiners, people are eventually more likely to be awarded benefits. And if we look at allowance rates, of course, more generous examiners are more likely to be. And the opposite is also true. Examiner time has a major effect on processing time, of course. And then more generous, more lenient examiners substantially reduce processing time because, of course, if you're allowed initially, you don't appeal that. Okay, great. So here, I'm going to focus first on the initially allowed. Why that? Because we don't, for that group, as far as we know, as far as we can tell, there's no relationship between examiner speed and leniency. They have the same, and so we think this is a valid instrument for waiting time for people who are initially allowed. We don't need to subsequently instrument for the allowance decision. So here's just the OLS estimate. Here's the IV estimate. It's larger. I'll scale that for you in a minute, right? And let me say this is after 2 years after applying. So everyone applied in 2005. 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, and this actually grows a bit over time. The fact that it's larger than the OLS estimate is consistent with the fact that the less healthy people are allowed more rapidly, right? So in other words, a longer allowance time is consistent with among the allowed, longer allowance time is among the healthier people, right? So that would bias us towards 0, and then once we actually isolate random or exogenous variation in that, we find a somewhat larger effect. And just to give you, what does this actually mean? So the share employed among people who are allowed is on the order of 10% over the next 3 years. If we use an average allowance time of just 3.7 months, right, this results in a reduction in labor force participation on the order of 1 to 1.3 percentage points, about 10%. These are low earnings people. That's not a huge piece of GDP, obviously. Okay, let me show you, before I get to the main results, let me just say, here's a falsification test. We can look at people who were allowed within the first 5 months and people who were allowed after the first 5 months. And for the people allowed within the first 5 months, examiner time should have no effect on subsequent participation since they would have been out of the labor force in any case. And so here is what we get. This is the waiting time, the examiner allowance time during the waiting period, examiner allowance time after the waiting period. Obviously, this is larger again, right? And so this was, I'd say this was quite stunning to us, right? We were very skeptical of our own results until we saw this, and we don't have another explanation for this. You guys are very well might. Okay, so now I want to move to the larger group, which are the people who are, to include the initially denied and finally denied applicants. So here we're going to instrument both variables, both the amount of the waiting time and the probability of an award. And our dependent variable here is the probability that you have any employment over at 2, 4, and 6 years following application, right? So the employment rate is only on the order of about 20% for this group. So the processing time coefficients are actually very similar to what we saw previously, which is surprising, right? I would have thought they would be larger for this group. And the SSDI receipt effects are quite large. They're on the order of they're in the initial period they're 50%. In the later period they're 30%. I would say you can break this out by mental disorders, musculoskeletal disorders, interesting, and those two account for more than 50% of all new disability awards, are mental disorders and musculoskeletal disorders. People with mental disorders have very high subsequent labor force participation using the strategy. People with musculoskeletal disorders do not. I'm going to come to that. It's above the bound. So here, just to, again, scale these effects, right? Here, for allowed applicants, the allowance effect, right, is reducing their potential labor supply. You would say we see 8.5% of them working at 6 years. We would expect to see 48% of them working. For the denied applicants, there's obviously not an allowance effect, but we see a reduction in labor force participation given the amount they have weighted of about 3 percentage points. So pretty sizable. If you do this in terms of earnings, you can see the allowance effects are on the order of $5,000 per year of earnings, so not trivial. And the waiting time effects for those who are denied or allowed is again a reduction in earnings around $600 to $800. So final substantive point, which is waiting time bias. So as I said, the people who, if you simply use examiner leniency, the people who go to a lenient examiner are more likely to be allowed and to be allowed quickly. The people who go to a less lenient examiner are less likely to be allowed and more likely to appeal and spend additional months in the process. So a simple comparison of those two conflates the allowance effect with the decay effect. And you can see that by, here's the OLS estimate. This is the bound estimate, right? Compare allowed versus denied. Here is the instrumenting the allowance with, with examiner leniency without processing time. This is about the same as the bound estimate, a little bit smaller. So this would be consistent with Bound's argument that the bound estimate is an upper bound. Now, when you do them jointly, instrumenting both decay and allowance, this effect is actually larger in several cases than the bound estimate. In other words, the potential labor force participation of the people who are rejected at the time that they apply is greater than a simple comparison of accepted and rejected applicants would suggest because the decay has not set in. Okay, so concluding. So the delayed decay effect we think is surprisingly large. It's about 10% as large as the award effect for all allowed. Reduces earnings by $600 to $800. Interestingly, once we account for that, even the direct effect of awards appears to be larger. It's significantly larger than was previously thought. So the implications are that disability screening is a socially costly process. And even if screening is accurate, there's a potential additional value to speed, although recognizing that if you made the process instantaneous, a lot more people would apply, right? So it's not clear what the optimum is here. Thanks very much.
All right. I'm going to medical field. I just got a few comments. First, let me go back. I think it's a very important thing to get a really pretty central issue that, I don't know if it's completely ignored, but a lot of mostly ignored. Here it is. Right here. I think that just what you just said is this. If you look at the allowed applicants, because of this bias that you're comparing it to a group that's already been decayed relative to them because they waited longer, you underestimate gamma. But not only do you underestimate gamma, you completely ignore delta. So the extent to which people underestimated the true impact for these guys is much greater than what was in the literature before. So this bias not only caused you to underestimate the effect, but also miss an entirely different effect that's actually present. And then you didn't count at all the effect for the people who were denied. So that means the cost of, for example, if you think that the disability program is encouraging a bunch of people to apply who wouldn't otherwise apply, the cost of having that program is much greater than you might think because we've underestimated the direct effect if you're allowed, and we've underestimated the waiting time decay effect for both the allowed and the denied.
So it's kind of like a double whammy of having to ignore this. Now, one of the things that I want to point out, though, is in David, I think, in terms of my comments, a couple things I would want to think about. We're interested in estimating this decay effect, right? Which is really, you want to think of what's it like to be either waiting or on disability relative to being working in the labor market. That's really kind of the baseline. And, you know, for example, one of the things you do is you look at the allowed, and I think we talked about this earlier, you look at the allowed people. But think about, you have somebody, I apply here, I'm going to measure your labor force participation 2 years later here. And then we're looking at variation in when you got allowed. Well, we're not changing the amount of time you were working. The delta you're estimating is actually the incremental loss from waiting relative to being on disability. So the actual delta decay that's happening to people waiting has to be much, I would think, much bigger than that, because you're saying these guys' skills are decreasing faster. You're measuring how much faster they're decaying than for guys who are on disability. But the guys who are on disability got to be decaying much faster than guys who are working. So you've actually, I think, underestimated delta perhaps substantially. In fact, you could have gotten a negative delta if the guys who are waiting actually thought they might go back to work. Now they can't work during that period, but you know, take Bob's story. They don't go out and buy a bunch of golf clubs and a bunch of other stuff to get ready for disability, right? They're actually thinking they might have to go back to work. I'm just joking, but so I think you might actually not completely capture the entire story in this analysis. And that brings me to my second point, which is, the way I was thinking about it is, you're looking at random variation. And what we really care about is changes in expected duration. So it's like you've got variation in actual holding expected fixed, because we got a blind experiment here. That is, so I'm assuming it's blind. Maybe these guys actually have inside info. Oh, you've got Fred. Oh, he's really easy. He's going to give you a quick decision. I mean, probably these attorneys can tell you that, you know.
Not at the DDS level.
Yeah.
So in the ALJ level, yes.
Yeah,
They even work with the ALJ. Several have been jailed for that.
Yes, I did that. So I would have been my guess. But anyway, what I'm saying here is, what you're capturing is variation in actual holding expected fixed. What we really care about from a policy standpoint, or this true delta, call it that we're measuring, we're thinking about you want to extrapolate, well, in the average 11-month waiting period, how much did people's skills decay? Well, that's an expected duration. So now the question is, do people respond more to the unexpected part or to the expected part? And for most problems in economics, if it sort of follows the usual long run is more elastic than the short run phenomena, people are going to respond more to the expected changes because they can make more things to try to take advantage of that situation. I know I'm going to be out a long time. I know I'm less likely to work. That's going to reinforce my incentive to let my skills depreciate, because investment in skills, when you have a participation margin, has that classic increase in returns element to it. The more likely I am to work, the more I want to invest. The more I invest, the more likely I am to work. So you get this cascade effect. So again, I think that causes the delta to be kind of small relative to the true delta. And that's, I think, inherent in the design. And that's something I think is really important for people to think about more generally when we think about randomized designs. Because randomized designs, to the extent they're designed to handle selection, are great. On the other hand, they're not so great with regards to estimating the actual impacts if you think part of the impact is people are going to respond to the treatment. And this would be a case in point of that. And I think you just have to keep that in mind when you think about interpreting your results. So bottom line is, I think it's a really cool idea to think about, these incentive effects and what incentive effects they have. I think, maybe you could do a little more on the modeling and thinking about, what exactly you're comparing what to what. And then finally, I think, you can even go further back, right? Because guys are going to be making investments knowing what this process is going to look like, so they don't even start with the same place. So, there's probably a lot more interesting things that can be done. But in general, I think it sort of illustrates, at least to me, how a little bit deeper dive on the economic response to programs can give us additional insights beyond what you get if you don't have any economic sort of way of thinking about it. Just think about it as, a scientific lab experiment. Well, this is not, that's what you're saying here. This is not that giving them the award isn't just an experiment, because there's a process and the people respond to that process. And that process has its own effects on individuals. And I guess the kind of things I'm saying is one more step in that direction. So that's all the comments I had. We have more questions or from the audience. Gary?
Yeah.
David, you're in charge.
David, you generally know that rationing by time is a bad way to ration. I mean, there's a waiting time rationing, there are costs to it. You can't work and they appreciate you. Now, have you thought about alternative ways of making this decision where you don't have, you're not stretching people out and how long they have to wait without work?
Yeah, I actually have. So on the first point, I mean, someone could make an argument about sort of, queuing as a self-selection mechanism, right? That this process is so costly.
They charge a price, which makes the lease is transferable. I mean, waiting time is that way long.
Right, that's right.
No, but it's how do you screen with a price? How do you get it to the guys who don't want to work, who can't work?
You get it back if you win.
Yeah.
You pay for a fast decision. If the fast decision says you're really disabled, you get it back.
Well, I'm assuming I can do it all by judge. I don't want to do any.
You want a bond.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
many of the people who are applying for this program have very limited resources. It would be pretty, so let me say, I think a modern disability system should put assistance before screening, right? That actually what you should be doing is, if someone says, "Gee, I have an impairment that is interfering with my ability to work," the first thing she said, well, let's get you vocational rehab, let's get you assistive technology, let's do this, and then do everything we can to keep you employed, and then we'll do some screening down the road. And this is, so if you have a private disability insurance policy, which probably most of you do through university, if you make a claim, they will immediately start trying to get you back to work. Even during the elimination period when you're waiting to qualify for benefits, they'll say you can continue working, we won't count that against you. So their view is that the thing that ensures non-employment over the long run is severing the connection with the employer. Now, a lot of people applying for SSDI have been unemployed for a long time, right? They often have gone through everything else. So it's not like this is a matter of keeping them in their job, but it's clear that this process has many deadweight losses. Let me actually respond to one insight that Kevin had about the sort of, you would expect the decay effect to be larger for the people who are denied. Because you don't have this additional, so I should say we have results on that we, that I didn't put up partly because we haven't got to double check them because Alexi's mom passed away last week. But it is the case that we do an interaction between the award and the time, and we find a larger negative effect for people who are for when we do that interaction, implying that the effects are larger for people who are denied. But it's preliminary. Yeah, Bob.
Part of an answer to Gary's question and Derek's response, sort of the role of the lawyer who's on a contingency fee, who's supplying information to the...
Yes, it's believed that the optimal time for a lawyer is that you want the case to go about 2 years, because then there's about $24,000 in back payment, 25% of that is $6,000. After that, you have nothing at the margin. So yes, it is believed that attorneys have an incentive to draw this out, and unlike most criminal proceedings or other type, the case record is not closed until the actual ALJ hearing occurs, which means that attorneys can continue to add evidence. So they can actually deliberately build a weaker case and then continue to add. So, yeah, right. Oh, sure, absolutely, absolutely, SSA, SSA spends a lot of money on trying to speed up the determination process. They have almost no control over the administrative law judges, but they have thought at various times about changing the evidentiary rules.
David Autor.
Yeah, great. Okay. So I may have misunderstood the specification, but in the second or last slide, where you, wouldn't an alternative interpretation of that be that you're basically showing us the comparison of the middle row and the middle column? Yeah, you're basically showing us an over-identification test.
Yeah, that's correct. So this is an over-identification test for just using the examiner leniency as an instrument for allowance. And this says that if you use effectively a different set of instruments, you get a different answer. Those are significantly different. So that's correct. It's violating the exclusion restriction. The exclusion restriction is that leniency only affects subsequent labor supply through the allowance decision.
So, okay, so if that's right, then how are we supposed to interpret the version that uses both instruments, one of which you're convinced?
No, they're fine used in conjunction, right? Well, so what we're positing, okay, so we're making an additional exclusion restriction that there are only two ways in which the examiner affects your subsequent outcomes. One is through leniency and one is through waiting time, right? So that's an addition. So we're making a richer but still fundamentally, not fully tested exclusion restriction, which are these two dimensions are what matter.
In the logic of like a balance test in an experiment, is there some way to show some empirical pattern that would, like, if that,
Sure.
if that
Yeah, so what you can do is you can basically do a test of using all the examiner dummies as instruments relative to a parameterization of those dummies as two means and ask whether the data want all those additional dummies. So that's something we're working on. Yeah. Great, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and an honor. So congratulations to Finance.